In the Soviet Union, a country where serial killers officially did not exist, a monster operated for decades. His name became synonymous with unspeakable horror, and his deeds exposed the cracks in the very system that so diligently denied his existence. This is the story of Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Rostov Ripper, the Red Ripper, a man whose shadow fell over an entire era. Today, we delve not just into the chronology of his bloody crimes. We will try to understand how this man managed to go unnoticed for so long, what impact he had on Soviet society, paralyzed by fear and rumors, and how his case became a dark symbol of a decaying empire. This is a story not only about a maniac, but also about the system that spawned him and, for a long time, could not stop him. Part 1. The Roots of Evil. The monster's childhood and youth. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the Ukrainian village of Yabloknoy. 1. His childhood coincided with terrible years after the Holodomor, which claimed millions of lives, and on the eve of World War II. 1. The family lived in extreme poverty, often starving. 1. His mother, Anna, constantly told young Andrei a horrific story about his older brother Stepan, who was allegedly kidnapped and eaten by neighbors, driven mad by hunger. 1. This story, whose truth was never established, was forever imprinted on his consciousness. Physical deprivation was compounded by humiliation. Chikatilo suffered from enuresis, and his mother severely punished him for every offense. 1. He grew up a weak, sickly child, suffering from myopia, which made him a constant target for ridicule from his peers. 1. His father, Roman, was mobilized to the front and captured, which was considered a disgrace in Soviet society and further exacerbated the family's isolation. Adolescence brought new torments. Chikatilo faced sexual impotence, which became a source of deep shame and ridicule. 1. Failed attempts at intimacy with girls only intensified his inferiority complex and self-hatred. 1. Despite this, he studied well, received an education, and even worked for a time as a teacher of Russian language and literature. 2. However, even here, his dark side manifested. Accusations of molesting students led to his dismissal. All these factors, a starved childhood, war trauma, physical defects, sexual problems, and social isolation, intertwined into a monstrous knot in Chikatilo's soul, laying the foundation for future atrocities. 10. He felt like a nobody, and this feeling demanded an outlet, a compensation, and he found it in the most terrible way, in power over someone else's life and death. Part 2. First victims and the bloody signature. Chikatilo committed his first officially registered murder on December 22, 1978. 1. His victim was 9-year-old Lena Zakatnova in the town of Shakhty, Rostov Oblast. 2. It was at this moment, by his own admission, that he experienced sexual satisfaction from violence and murder, something he could not achieve in ordinary life. 6. This became a discovery for him, a point of no return. After the first murder, there was a 3-year hiatus, but then Chikatilo began to kill with horrifying regularity. 2. His victims were the most vulnerable: children, teenagers, young women, often homeless, runaways from orphanages, prostitutes, those whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed. 6. He stalked them at train stations, bus stops, and on commuter trains. The killer's signature was monstrously cruel. After luring a victim to a deserted place, a forest belt, or a park, Chikatilo would attack. 6. He would rape and then kill with extreme brutality, inflicting dozens of stab wounds. His victims suffered horrific mutilations. He cut off genitals, gouged out eyes, and sometimes bit off body parts, including the tongue and tips of the nose. 1. Chikatilo later explained gouging out the eyes by a superstition that the killer's image remained in the victim's eyes. 6. In some cases, he committed acts of cannibalism. For Chikatilo, these rituals were a way to assert his power, to compensate for his own insignificance and sexual inadequacy. Violence and murder gave him the perverted satisfaction he craved. He was a predator, carefully choosing his victims and places for slaughter. With each new murder, Chikatilo became more audacious. The number of victims grew. In 1982, 7 deaths were recorded. In 1984, already 13. 6 bodies were found in forest belts, near railway tracks, in parks. Rostov Oblast and neighboring regions were gripped by terror. But the Soviet system was not prepared to admit that a serial killer could exist in a socialist country. Part 3. Hunting a Ghost, Operation Forest Stripe, and the System's Impotence. In the Soviet Union, it was officially believed that serial killings were a vice of the capitalist West. Therefore, when mutilated bodies began to be found in Rostov Oblast, the authorities for a long time refused to admit the obvious. Information about the crimes was suppressed in the press to avoid sowing panic and undermining faith in an ideal society. 6. This silence and denial created ideal conditions for Chikatilo to continue his bloody harvest. The police worked under enormous pressure. Quick results were demanded. Quotas for crime solving had to be met. This led to monstrous mistakes and tragedies. People were arrested, confessions extracted through torture. 6. For the first murder committed by Chikatilo, Alexander Kravchenko was mistakenly convicted and executed. 6. Several people committed suicide after false accusations. Because some victims were boys, persecution of the homosexual community began, as they were also targeted as scapegoats. Finally, the scale of the tragedy became too great to ignore. An operation codenamed Lesopolosa, Forest Stripe, was launched. 6. The best investigators, including Viktor Burakov and Mikhail Fedosov, were brought in. 20. But they faced incredible difficulties. A vast search area, lack of experience in investigating serial murders, bureaucratic obstacles, and the same reluctance from top leadership to acknowledge reality. Chikatilo, meanwhile, masterfully eluded justice. His appearance, an ordinary, unremarkable middle-aged man, often in a suit and carrying a briefcase, did not arouse suspicion. 24. In Soviet society, where it was customary to trust elders and comrades, he easily gained the trust of his future victims. 24. When the police intensified patrols in one area, he simply changed his hunting ground. A fatal mistake by criminologists also played a role. In 1984, Chikatilo was detained on suspicion of molestation. A knife and other suspicious items were found on him. However, analysis showed that his blood type, A, did not match the blood type, AB, found in semen traces on the bodies of some victims. No one knew then that Chikatilo belonged to a rare group of people, non-secretors, whose blood type and bodily fluids can differ from their blood type. This mistake cost many more lives. Chikatilo was convicted only of petty theft and soon released. Years passed, and the killer continued to operate. Fear gripped Rostov and its surroundings. People were afraid to let their children out on the streets, avoided forest belts, and deserted places. The wildest rumors spread. Talk of a Caucasian gang, of police officers carrying out vigilante justice, even of government officials involved in the murders. The psychological pressure on investigators was colossal. One of them, according to rumors, began to see hallucinations in which he himself committed these murders. In a desperate attempt to understand who they were dealing with, investigators turned to psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky. Buchanovsky, a specialist in abnormal psychology, compiled a strikingly accurate psychological profile of the killer. He suggested it was a middle-aged man, probably married with children, who had suffered from humiliation and sexual complexes all his life, and found an outlet for his frustration in necrosadistic murders. Chikatilo's psychological analysis reveals a complex picture. His actions were driven by deep childhood traumas, poverty, social isolation, and crucially, severe sexual disorders. He suffered from erotophonophilia, sexual arousal achieved through murder. Murder and subsequent manipulations with the victims' bodies were the only way for him to achieve sexual satisfaction and feel an illusion of power and control. Experts also point to signs of antisocial personality disorder, sadism, ritualistic behavior, and possibly even organic brain damage. An important element of his psychology was the dehumanization of his victims. To commit his monstrous acts, he needed to strip them of their human form in his own eyes, turning them into inanimate objects for satisfying his perverted needs. This allowed him to switch off any remaining conscience and morality. Despite the monstrosity of his crimes, in ordinary life, Chikatilo tried to appear normal, a model family man, a member of the Communist Party, a worker. This double life, the ability to switch between the role of an ordinary citizen and a ruthless killer, is a characteristic feature of many serial maniacs and made his capture even more difficult. Part 5. The End of Terror. Arrest, Trial, and Execution. By the end of the 1980s, with the advent of glasnost, it became impossible to hide the truth about the serial killer. Public pressure on law enforcement agencies increased manifold. Patrols were intensified, especially in areas where Chikatilo most often attacked. On November 6, 1990, after committing his last murder, Chikatilo behaved suspiciously at a railway station, which attracted the attention of police officers. His details were checked and linked to his previous detention in 1984. He was placed under surveillance. On November 20,990, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested. Initially, he denied everything. Investigators then turned again to Dr. Bukanovsky. The psychiatrist had several conversations with Chikatilo, appealing to his vanity, his interest in his unique psychology from a scientific point of view. This approach worked. Chikatilo began to confess, describing his crimes in detail and even pointing out burial sites of previously unknown victims. In total, he confessed to 56 murders, although he was charged with 53 and convicted of 52. Narrator: 20, 15, 21, 30. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began in April 1992. The proceedings took place in Rostov-on-Don and attracted enormous public and media attention. Now free from previous prohibitions, Chikatilo was held in a specially built iron cage in the courtroom to protect him from the wrath of the victims' relatives. During the sessions, he behaved erratically, shouting, singing, cursing, yelling incoherent phrases, and on one occasion, even exposing his genitals to those present. This was either an attempt to feign insanity or a true manifestation of his madness. Despite his behavior, a psychiatric examination found Chikatilo sane and responsible for his actions. There was more than enough evidence of his guilt. In October 1992, the court delivered its verdict. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death for each of them. All his appeals were rejected. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was executed by a shot to the back of the head in Novokherkassk prison. Thus ended the story of one of the most brutal serial killers of the 20th century. The Chikatilo case had a colossal impact on Soviet and then post-Soviet society. It didn't just terrify millions, it shattered one of the main myths of Soviet propaganda, the myth of a safe, almost crime-free society where such atrocities were impossible. The years Chikatilo was at large became a time of total fear for the residents of Rostov and its surroundings. Parents were afraid to let their children go out alone. Adults avoided deserted places. Trust in law enforcement, already low, was completely undermined. The system that was supposed to protect its citizens proved incapable of dealing with an internal enemy. Moreover, its ideological attitudes and the incompetence of individual officials contributed to the maniac remaining at large for so long. Chikatilo skillfully exploited features of the Soviet mentality: respect for elders, addressing strangers as comrade or uncle. 24. His unremarkable appearance and demeanor did not arouse suspicion in a society unaccustomed to expecting threats from one of their own. This became a bitter lesson for many. With the advent of glasnost, the Chikatilo case received wide publicity. From a topic forbidden for discussion, it turned into a media sensation. Newspapers and television covered the investigation and trial in detail, shocking society with the specifics of the crime. This was part of a painful process of recognizing the dark sides of reality that had been hidden for so long behind the facade of official propaganda. Andrei Chikatilo became more than just a name in criminal chronicles. He turned into a grim symbol, an embodiment of evil that can hide beneath the mask of ordinariness, and a reminder of the fragility of human life and public safety. His story is also a story of systemic failures, of the price of denying the truth, and of how fear can paralyze an entire society. And although the Rostov Ripper is long dead, the echo of his crimes still resonates in the collective memory. It forces us to reflect on the nature of evil, the importance of vigilance, and the fact that even in the most seemingly orderly society, monsters can lurk. Studying cases like Chikatilo's is necessary not to revel in horror, but to learn lessons and strive to prevent such tragedies from happening again.